The small town of Saint-Malo, located on the coast of Brittany in northwestern France, had always been a place where history and the sea blended into one essence. With its high walls that stood firm against the Atlantic's onslaught and cobblestone streets seemingly trapped in time, Saint-Malo attracted tourists year-round. The streets, lined with medieval and colonial architecture, reminded visitors of the days when the city was home to corsairs who sailed the oceans in search of treasure. That afternoon, however, there were no tourists admiring the ancient ships moored in the harbor. A fierce storm had struck unexpectedly, darkening the sky that had been clear just a few hours earlier. The clouds, heavy with water, quickly blanketed the bay, turning the gentle whisper of the wind into a deafening roar that echoed through the town's alleys. The rain began to fall with overwhelming force, lashing the slate rooftops and transforming the cobbled streets into small rivers. Henri Dubois, a man in his 50s, watched the storm through the windshield of his car, a mixture of nostalgia and sadness in his gaze. He slowly drove his old Citroën, a car he had inherited from his father many years ago, through the narrow streets surrounding the old town. The car's lights flickered as they passed by the windows of small shops and cafés, already closed due to the storm. Henri was a successful man. He had spent decades building a chain of hotels that attracted tourists to Saint-Malo from all over the world. Yet, professional success had not filled the void in his life. He had lost his wife, Elise, 5 years ago in a car accident, and since then, the joy that once filled his life had been replaced by a sense of loneliness. As the Citroën slowly advanced, the sound of the rain tapping on the car's roof reminded him of the many nights he had spent talking with Elise about their dreams and aspirations. Often, after long, exhausting days, they would meet in the kitchen of their home, perched on the highest hill in the city, from where they could see the harbor. Henri's heart tightened at the memory of those moments. After Elise's death, the house had become unbearably large and empty, with every corner seeming to hold an echo of her laughter. He had tried to bury himself even more in his work to fill the void, but over the years, he had learned that work could never replace the people he loved. Now, as he drove through the streets of Saint-Malo, he wondered if he would ever find anything that could reignite his passion for life. The rain trickled down the windshield in an endless race, while the windshield wipers struggled to clear the water falling with such intensity that it made it impossible to see beyond a few meters. Rue de la Marine, usually bustling with tourists and locals strolling or having coffee at the small bistros, was deserted. Only a few passers-by hurried under ineffective umbrellas, seeking shelter. The lights of the shops reflected in the puddles, flickering with a ghostly glow, distorted by the currents of water running down the streets. Henri turned a corner bordering the city's ancient wall, built in the Middle Ages to protect Saint-Malo from invaders. He had always felt a special connection with those walls, perhaps because his grandfather had been a staunch defender of the city's historical heritage. Henri often wondered what his grandfather would think of what the town had become. Tourism had brought prosperity, but it had also transformed Saint-Malo's tranquil essence into a vibrant, often chaotic attraction. As he turned onto one of the narrower streets of the old town, Henri had to brake abruptly. The traffic light, dimly lit in red and barely visible through the rain, forced him to stop. Ahead of him, a few cars crawled along, trapped in the buildup of water that turned the road into an improvised lagoon. While waiting for the light to change, something on the sidewalk caught his attention. Under the downpour, huddled against a stone wall, was a small figure. At first, Henri thought it was just a bundle or a shadow cast by the streetlights, but upon closer inspection, he realized it was a little girl. A girl no older than 7 years old. She was completely drenched, her hair plastered to her head, and her small hands trembled as she clutched something to her chest. Looking more closely, Henri saw that what the girl was holding was not a simple toy or a bag, it was a baby. His heart stopped for a moment. A little girl, alone in the storm, holding a baby. The impulse to do something hit him like a wave, something completely out of his usual character. He wasn't the type of man to get involved in other people's problems, but something about that scene moved him in a way he couldn't explain. Without thinking twice, he parked his car by the curb and turned off the engine. The rain hit him hard as soon as he stepped out, drenching his jacket and hair in seconds, but he didn't care. He quickly walked toward the girl, careful not to scare her. "Bonjour, petite," he said softly, trying to be heard over the roar of the storm. "What are you doing here, alone, in the rain?" The girl slowly lifted her gaze, and what Henri saw in her eyes chilled him. It wasn't just the cold that made her tremble, it was fear and despair reflected in her large, dark eyes. She clutched the baby tighter to her chest, as if it were the only thing left in her world. Henri knelt beside her, trying to seem as non-threatening as possible. "Where are your parents?" he asked, hoping for some rational explanation for what he was witnessing. "Are they nearby?" The girl looked at him for a few seconds, as if trying to decide whether she could trust him. Finally, she spoke in a whisper so faint that Henri had to lean closer to hear her. "I don't have parents," she said, her voice so weak it seemed about to break. "They left us here." Henri felt a knot form in his stomach. Something about this situation felt profoundly wrong. He had heard rumors that the town wasn't as peaceful and safe as it seemed, but he never imagined he would come across a child abandoned in such a way, let alone in the middle of a storm, holding a baby in her arms. "Who left you here?" he asked, this time with more seriousness, unable to hide the concern in his voice. "Do you know the name of the person?" The girl hesitated before answering, as if what she was about to say could bring even more trouble. "The woman from the orphanage," she finally responded, looking down at the ground. "She said she didn't want to take care of me and my brother anymore." Henri remained silent for a moment, processing what he had just heard. An orphanage that abandoned a child on the street, in the middle of a storm, with a baby in her arms. Not only was that cruel, it was utterly unthinkable, even in a small town like Saint-Malo. Something was deeply wrong. He knew he couldn't leave those children there, not for one more minute. He crouched down closer to the girl and spoke as calmly as he could muster. "Come on, let's get out of this rain. I'll take you to a safe place, and then we'll figure this out together." The girl looked at him with distrust at first, but the warmth in Henri's voice convinced her. Slowly, she extended her small hand toward him, trembling from the cold and fear. Henri helped her to her feet and together they walked to his car, while the rain continued to pummel the stones of the town with relentless force. Henri opened the back door of his Citroën and helped the girl inside, making sure the baby was protected from the rain. As he settled back into the driver's seat, he glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the girl curled up in the back seat, trying to soothe the baby, who whimpered with hunger or cold. Henri couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change in an irreversible way. The rain continued to fall without mercy as Henri drove through the winding streets of Saint-Malo, his mind flooded with thoughts. He knew he had to find out what was happening at that orphanage, and more importantly, how he could help these two small lives that had suddenly fallen under his care. Minutes passed as the car crept through the wet streets. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he decided to stop at a small café he knew well, a discreet and cozy place where he could warm the children up and perhaps learn more about the situation. Henri's car slid to a stop in front of Café de Remparts, a small rustic establishment that had always been his favorite retreat from the hustle and bustle of life. Soft lights escaped from the fogged-up windows, giving the place a sense of warmth and refuge, a stark contrast to the storm raging outside. The rain still pounded relentlessly on the windshield, but inside the car, the baby's cries were growing more insistent. Henri knew they couldn't wait any longer. With a quick movement, Henri got out of the car and opened the trunk, searching for an umbrella he had left there. Though the strong wind made it difficult to keep the umbrella steady, he managed to cover the girl as she stepped out, cradling the baby in her arms. "Come, dear. Let's go inside and warm up a little," he said, smiling at her to reassure her. The girl, soaked and shivering, nodded silently, holding her little brother even tighter as if she feared the world might snatch him away at any moment. Together, they crossed the small sidewalk under the rain and entered the café. Inside, they were greeted by the warm aroma of fresh coffee and newly baked bread, along with the soft crackling of a fireplace in the back of the room. The café was nearly empty, except for a couple of regular patrons watching the downpour through the fogged-up windows. Sophie, the café's owner, a middle-aged woman with tousled blonde hair and a kind smile, looked up when she heard the door open. "Henri, what a surprise to see you here in this weather. What brings you out in this storm?" she asked, drying her hands on her apron as she walked toward them. Her expression changed when she saw the drenched children and the small baby in the girl's arms. Sophie's face shifted from surprise to concern. "My God, what's happened? Who are these children?" she asked, visibly tense. Henri didn't waste time with long explanations. He knew the most urgent thing was to get the children to safety. "It's a long story, Sophie. They need warmth, food, and a place to recover from the cold. Could you bring us something hot to drink and a towel?" Henri asked, gently guiding her toward the kitchen. Sophie, always accommodating, nodded quickly. "Of course, whatever they need. I'll be right back." As Sophie disappeared into the kitchen, Henri helped the girls sit at a table near the fireplace, making sure the baby was comfortable. Little Louis, no more than a few months old, seemed exhausted and hungry, his whimpers now weak and filled with distress. Amélie, the girl, hugged him tightly, as if the world around her was crumbling. "What's your name, little one?" Henri asked as he sat down across from her, hoping to create a trusting atmosphere. "Amélie, sir," the girl replied in a timid voice, still not raising her eyes much. "That's a lovely name, Amélie. And, what's your little brother's name?" Henri continued, hoping to ease the tension of the moment. "Louis," she said, looking at the baby with a mix of worry and exhaustion. "He's very small. He's always crying, he's hungry." Henri felt a surge of compassion for this girl who, despite her young age, already carried such a heavy responsibility. He wanted to ask her more about what had happened, but he knew he had to be careful. He didn't want to push her too much. At that moment, Sophie returned with 2 cups of hot chocolate and a soft towel. She placed a cup in front of Amélie and offered her the towel to dry off. "Here you go, dear. This will help you warm up," Sophie said with an encouraging smile. Amélie took the cup with both hands, but didn't drink right away. She seemed to be fighting against the exhaustion and fear that had accompanied her until now. Henri watched her silently, giving her the space she needed to relax. Meanwhile, he gently stroked the baby's head, trying to calm him. Despite his small size, Louis wore an expression of deep anguish, as though the tension of the day had completely worn him out. After a few minutes of silence, Amélie began to speak. Her voice trembled slightly, but Henri could clearly hear the fear in her words. "The lady at the orphanage was always angry. She said we were a burden, that no one wanted children like us. One day, she put us in her car and left us in the city. She said no one would miss us." Tears began to roll down Amélie's cheeks as she tried to hold back her sadness. Henri listened intently, processing every word. The fact that someone could abandon 2 children in the middle of a storm was inconceivable to him. Henri felt a mix of anger and compassion welling up inside him. He knew that Amélie needed more than just a warm meal and shelter tonight, she needed help to escape the shadow of that orphanage and the abuse she had suffered. "You won't have to go back there, Amélie. I promise. But we need to figure out what's happening at that orphanage. If they did this to you and Louis, there may be other children in the same situation," Henri said, trying to convey as much calm as possible. Amélie looked at Henri with fearful eyes, but for the first time since he found her, he saw something else in her gaze, a small spark of hope. "I trust you," she said at last, with unexpected courage for someone so young. Henri felt a sense of responsibility he had never experienced before. He knew that his life was about to change forever. He couldn't simply take these children to social services and forget about them. Something deeper was stirring inside him, a need to protect them, to give them a chance to live the life they deserved. The café was warm and cozy, but the storm outside was still chaotic. The rain continued to beat fiercely against the windows of the small establishment. The other customers glanced over at Henri and the children, murmuring quietly, but they respected the space he needed to handle the situation. Finally, Sophie approached again, this time with a determined look on her face. "Henri, is there anything else I can do? It looks like these kids have been through a rough time," she said, genuine concern in her voice. Henri nodded, grateful for Sophie's understanding. "I'm going to make some calls. I need help to get this sorted, and these children can't go back to that orphanage. Can you watch them for a moment?" "I won't be long," Henri asked as he stood up from the table. Sophie, always kind and supportive, nodded without hesitation. "Of course, Henri. Don't worry, they'll be safe here with me," she said, winking at Amélie and offering her another cookie. Henri stepped outside the café and walked over to a small phone booth across the street. Despite the storm still raging through the city, he pulled out his mobile phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. The phone rang several times before someone finally picked up. "Commissioner Moreau," the voice on the other end sounded formal and direct. "Moreau, it's Henri Dubois," Henri replied, raising his voice so his friend could hear him over the sound of the rain pounding against the glass of the phone booth. "Henri, it's been a long time. What can I do for you?" Moreau's tone relaxed upon recognizing his old friend's voice. Henri wasted no time with introductions. He knew that what he was about to say would change the course of the night, but he also knew he had no other choice. "I found 2 children, Amélie and Louis. They were abandoned in the street, in the middle of this storm. They're from an orphanage that seems to be involved in something shady. I need your help, Moreau. This can't be left unresolved." Henri paused, feeling the gravity of his words. On the other end of the line, Moreau remained silent for a moment, processing what he had just heard. "This is serious, Henri. If what you're saying is true, we're dealing with a major crime. I need more information about that orphanage. If we can link that woman to any illegal activity, I promise we'll act immediately," Moreau finally responded, his tone much more serious now. "The orphanage is called La Maison d'Enfants. It's on the outskirts of town, on the way to Dinant. I don't know exactly what's going on there, but these children have been mistreated and abandoned. I need you to investigate, Moreau." "Something is very wrong," Henri insisted, gripping the phone tightly as he watched the café's lights flicker through the rain. "I'll get on it, Henri. Trust me. In the meantime, make sure those children are safe." "I'll send someone right away," Moreau said, with a tone that made it clear he was already taking action. Henri hung up the phone, feeling that he had taken the first step in the right direction. But he knew this was just the beginning. He had to make sure Amélie and Louis were protected, and he also needed to uncover what was really happening at that orphanage. He quickly returned to the café, where he found Sophie playing with Louis, who had stopped crying and was staring intently at the fire in the fireplace. Amélie, though still trembling, seemed more relaxed as she took small sips of her hot chocolate. "Everything's in motion. The children are safe, Sophie. I've contacted Moreau," Henri said, thankful for his friend's support. Sophie nodded, not asking any further questions. She trusted Henri to handle the situation as far as it needed to go. Henri sat back down with Amélie and Louis at the café table. The warmth of the fireplace gave the space a comforting glow, and for a brief moment, the sound of the storm outside seemed to fade, if only in his mind. But the peace was fleeting. Henri knew that the real questions had yet to be answered. He needed to know more about what was happening at La Maison d'Enfants, the orphanage from which the children came. Amélie, though appearing calmer, was still on edge, and Henri could see the tension in her small shoulders. "Amélie, sweetheart," Henri said, leaning forward, "can you tell me more about what happened at the orphanage? I know it's difficult, but we need to understand what happened there to help you and Louis." The girl lowered her gaze, fidgeting with a napkin between her fingers. For a moment, it seemed like she was hesitating, as if the words didn't want to come out, but after a deep sigh, she finally began to speak. At the orphanage, there were a lot of children. Not all were like us, she began, her voice soft and trembling. Some came and went quickly. The lady. Valérie, she said, with a tone of disgust that made Henri's heart sink, was always angry. She yelled at us a lot. Especially when Louis cried. She said we were a burden, that no one wanted children like us. Sometimes, when someone left, Valérie would say they had found a new home, but I didn't believe her. Henri listened carefully, not interrupting her, as Amélie continued describing her life at the orphanage. Every word she spoke made Henri feel a growing indignation. What Amélie was describing wasn't just poor conditions, it was neglect and abuse. Worse still, it seemed some children had disappeared under suspicious circumstances. One day, Valérie got really mad because Louis was crying. She said she couldn't take it anymore. She put us in her car and drove us to the city, and when we got there, she just left us. I tried to follow her, but, she drove away, Amélie said, and Henri could see the tears welling up in her eyes. Henri clenched his fists under the table, feeling a cold anger rising within him. He knew he couldn't let this abuse continue, especially not in a place that was supposed to protect defenseless children. Amélie, you've been very brave to tell me all of this, Henri said, his voice softer than usual. He knew he couldn't push her any further. This little girl had already endured too much. Just then, Henri's mobile phone vibrated on the table. He quickly picked it up and saw a message from Moreau. I've sent a team to investigate the orphanage. I need you to come to the station to discuss what they've found. Henri felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He knew things were moving fast, but he couldn't leave Amélie and Louis alone. He looked at Sophie, who was watching them from behind the counter. Sophie, can you stay with the children a little longer? I have to go to the station, but I don't want to leave them alone, Henri asked. Sophie, with her usual kindness, nodded immediately. Of course, Henri. They'll be safe here with me. Go do what you need to do, she replied with a reassuring smile. Henri bent down to speak to Amélie. I have to step out for a bit, Amélie. I'm going to find out more about that place, but don't worry, you'll be safe here with Sophie. I won't be long, he said, gently stroking her hair. Amélie nodded, still holding little Louis in her arms. Be careful, Mr. Henri, the girl whispered, with a maturity Henri didn't expect from someone so young. Henri stepped out of the café and into the rain, this time not bothering with the umbrella. He got into his Citroën and drove quickly toward the police station. The road was dark, and the empty streets gave him an unsettling feeling. Something was terribly wrong at that orphanage, and Henri knew he had to get to the bottom of it. The Saint-Malo police station was brightly lit, with a few patrol cars parked out front. Henri hurried inside, drenched from the rain, and was greeted by Commissioner Moreau, who was waiting for him in the lobby. Henri, come with me. We need to talk, Moreau said without wasting time. Henri followed him through the hallways of the station to a small meeting room. On the table were several open files and a board with photos and maps. Moreau gestured for him to sit down, then began to speak. Henri, what you've brought to light is much bigger than we imagined, Moreau started, his expression grave. La Maison d'Enfants has been under suspicion for a while, but we never had enough evidence to act. Now, with what the girl has told us and what we found today, we're looking at a much more serious case. It's possible that Valérie Roussel, the director of the orphanage, is involved in child trafficking. Henri felt as if the world stopped for a moment. He had known the orphanage was problematic, but he never imagined something so horrific. Child trafficking. How is it possible no one noticed before? Henri asked, incredulous. Valérie is clever. She's managed to cover her tracks for a long time. She has connections with powerful people in the city and beyond. Many of the children who disappeared were supposedly adopted, but the adoptions were never officially registered. And those who asked too many questions were silenced or simply fired, Moreau explained, pointing to a file on the table. Henri glanced at the documents. There were reports from former employees who had tried to report irregularities, but none had made it far. Valérie had used her network of contacts to keep the orphanage off the radar of the authorities. So what do we do now? Henri asked, determined to help in any way he could. Moreau leaned in closer, lowering his voice. We've gathered enough information to intervene. But this won't be easy. Valérie has allies in the city. We need solid evidence of what's going on inside the orphanage and who's involved in her network. We have to act fast before Valérie realizes we're investigating. Henri nodded. He knew the situation was critical, and time wasn't on their side. I'll help, Moreau. Whatever it takes. I can't let these children keep suffering. The commissioner looked at him with respect. He knew Henri wasn't a man of many words, but his determination was clear. Thank you, Henri. We're going to need all the help we can get. We'll begin with undercover surveillance of the orphanage and try to gather more evidence before making a raid. If we find the missing children, we'll be able to take Valérie and her accomplices down. Henri stood up from his chair, feeling a mix of adrenaline and nerves. He knew the next step would be dangerous, but there was no turning back. The lives of Amélie, Louis, and many other children depended on what they did in the coming days. I'll do whatever it takes, Henri said with a firmness in his voice that left no room for doubt. Moreau nodded, preparing for the storm that was about to break loose. The storm raging outside seemed to mirror the chaos that was soon to unfold within the small town of Saint-Malo. The next morning, as the timid sun began to peek through the scattered clouds, Henri returned to the café to check on Amélie and Louis. Both were still asleep, wrapped in blankets that Sophie had provided. The warmth from the fireplace made the place feel cozy and safe, but Henri knew they couldn't stay there indefinitely. Sophie approached him quietly, holding a cup of coffee. Any news? She asked in a low voice, so as not to wake the children. Henri sighed and took a sip of the coffee. It's worse than we imagined. Valérie is involved in something much darker, he said, not going into details, but enough for Sophie to grasp the seriousness of the situation. Sophie's face showed her concern. So what do we do now? She asked. Henri didn't have a clear answer, but he knew one thing for sure, he couldn't let these children go back to that orphanage. Not while Valérie was still in charge. The café, in the calm morning light of Saint-Malo, seemed like a place of peace. But within Henri, a storm was raging. He knew that the tranquility he felt watching Amélie and Louis sleep by the fire was fragile, a temporary illusion. Beyond the café doors, the reality of La Maison d'Enfants and the horrors Valérie had inflicted were still lurking. I can't let them go back there, Sophie. These children, Henri lowered his voice, looking at the little ones bundled up in their blankets. Something else is happening in that orphanage. Moreau confirmed that Valérie is involved in something much more sinister. Steps are being taken, but I need to do more. Sophie looked at him with concern. She had seen Henri determined before, but never with such intensity. She knew he wouldn't stop until he uncovered the truth. So, what do you need? Sophie asked, fully aware that Henri was about to make decisions that would change not only his life but the lives of these children as well. Henri slowly stood up from his seat, his thoughts spinning around what he had learned at the station. He knew the police were already monitoring the orphanage, but that wasn't enough. Concrete evidence was needed, something that would directly incriminate Valérie and allow the police to act with full force. I need to go back to that place. If I can get inside, maybe I can find something that Moreau can use to stop her once and for all. If she suspects we're close, she could try to hide everything, or worse, make the children disappear. I can't wait for that to happen, Henri said, his voice firm. Sophie was silent for a moment, processing what Henri was suggesting. She knew he was willing to take a risk, but entering the orphanage, without full police support, was a dangerous move. "Are you sure?" she finally asked, her voice filled with concern. "You could get into serious trouble, and if Valérie really is involved in child trafficking, she won't hesitate to protect her network at all costs. This could be dangerous, Henri." Henri knew the risk. He knew it was significant, but he also knew there were no other options. If he didn't act soon, he feared the case might fall apart, or that Valérie would escape justice once again. "I don't have a choice. Amélie and Louis, and who knows how many other children, have been victims of that woman for too long. I can't live knowing I didn't do everything I could to stop her," Henri responded with determination. Sophie watched him for a long moment, evaluating his resolve. Finally, she nodded. "All right, Henri. But promise me you won't do this alone. Involve Moreau, at least so they know what you're doing," Sophie said, a mix of worry and support in her voice. "I will. I just need to figure out how to get in without raising suspicion." Henri knew he had to be careful. Valérie was a cunning woman, and any misstep could put both the children and himself in danger. After making that promise to Sophie, Henri left the café, leaving Amélie and Louis in her care. He got into his car and drove to the police station to meet with Commissioner Moreau. He knew that if he wanted the police to back his plan, he would need to present it carefully. When Henri arrived at the station, he found Moreau going over reports in his office. As he entered, the commissioner looked up and motioned for him to sit. "Henri, we have more information about La Maison d'Enfants. But before I tell you anything, what do you have in mind?" Moreau asked, as if he already suspected that Henri wasn't going to sit still and wait. Henri took a deep breath. He knew Moreau might reject his plan, but he had to try. "I need to get into the orphanage. We know Valérie is involved in something big, but we need concrete proof. I can't sit by knowing that those children are still in danger. If I can infiltrate, I might find documents, records, or anything that proves what she's doing." Moreau stared at him silently for a few seconds, weighing Henri's words. He knew that the businessman wasn't a police officer or an investigator, but he also knew that his determination came from a genuine place. "Henri, I understand what you're suggesting, but this isn't a game. If Valérie realizes someone is snooping into her business, she won't hesitate to act. And from what we've uncovered, she has powerful allies. Going in alone would be suicidal," Moreau said, placing his hands firmly on the desk. Henri nodded, but he wasn't willing to back down. "That's why I need your help. I'm not proposing to go in alone, but I know that if we act fast, before she catches on, we can get the evidence we need. Just tell me what you need from me to make it happen." Moreau studied him intensely, weighing the risk of the operation. After a few moments, he sighed. "All right. We'll do this my way. We're going to conduct an undercover operation. You'll be my contact inside the orphanage, but you'll be accompanied by 2 of my agents, who will pose as social workers. We'll infiltrate our people, and you'll have access to search for what we need. If things get out of hand, we'll all move in." Henri felt a sense of relief knowing Moreau was on his side. He knew the operation wouldn't be easy, but with the police's help, he had a better chance of success. "Thank you, Moreau. We'll do it your way," Henri said, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. 2 days later, the plan was in motion. Henri, along with 2 undercover agents, entered La Maison d'Enfants, posing as an inspection team on a surprise visit. The facade of the orphanage, with its old, crumbling walls, didn't reflect the horror that lurked inside. Valérie greeted them with a calculated smile, pretending a calm that Henri knew was only a facade. "What an unexpected surprise. What can I do for you?" Valérie asked, her voice smooth but sharp. The agents began the routine inspection, walking through the facilities, checking rooms, and speaking with the few children who were present. Meanwhile, Henri discreetly made his way to Valérie's office, searching for any sign of her illegal activities. He knew time was limited. Every minute that passed increased the risk that Valérie would become suspicious. However, his search soon bore fruit. Among a pile of disorganized documents, he found falsified adoption records, transfers of children, and suspicious financial transactions that didn't add up. With the evidence in hand, Henri knew there was no turning back. Valérie's network was about to crumble. That same night, armed with the gathered evidence, Moreau organized the raid on La Maison d'Enfants. The police stormed the orphanage, arresting Valérie and her accomplices. The children, including Amélie and Louis, were taken to a safe place. Henri watched from a distance as Valérie was handcuffed and escorted out of the orphanage. Her cold stare remained defiant, but she no longer had any power. She knew her empire of cruelty had come to an end. "Well done, Henri," Moreau said, approaching him. "Thanks to you, these children are safe, and Valérie will finally face justice." Henri, exhausted but satisfied, looked toward the ruined orphanage. He knew the battle was over, but the war